Told you. Great. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the AGOYO panel on Organists of Colors. My name is Jordan Prescott, and this is my second year serving on the national board for AGOYO. And it's my pleasure to moderate this conversation with this distinguished panel of organists and musicians. And so we'll just go around the circle and everyone can introduce themselves to orient the conversation, and then we'll get started. So to my left on my screen is Roshan, so we'll start with Roshan.
Sure. And also my surname starts with a C, so I'm so used to going first, actually. I'm sure you too. Hi, everyone. So my name is Roshan Chakane. I'm from South Africa originally. I came to the States in 2016, where I did my master's at Rutgers University. I was with Renee Dupret, and that's where I met Chelsea on one of our trips to Washington, D.C. And then I'm currently a DMA student at the University of Notre Dame, and I was with Hugh Lewis last year, and Kola Oluwabu just started with us. Fantastic man. And yeah, so that's what I'm currently doing.
Fabulous. And below him is Chelsea.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Chen, and I am living currently in Switzerland, although in the past was kind of going back and forth with New York City, and was there during the beginning of the pandemic. And during this time, it's pretty quiet for me because normally I would be traveling for concerts. There were a couple that still happened here in Switzerland. Other than that, I'm focusing on writing music and practicing at home and studying German.
Fabulous. And David.
Hi, I'm David Hurd. I'm a resident of New York, have been for many years. For many years, I was professor of church music at the General Theological Seminary in Manhattan, and now I'm organist and music director at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Times Square. And I have been in sort of a semi-self-imposed quarantine in my apartment in Yonkers, and practicing and doing Zoom meetings.
Fabulous. And Janet.
I'm Janet Yieh, and I am also here in New York City. I'm in Midtown, and I am associate organist at Trinity Church Wall Street downtown, and sort of also active with the New York City AGO, and like Chelsea, also a graduate of Hurd and Yale Institute of Sacred Music.
Great. Well, it is a pleasure to have you all with us for this conversation. And I'm hoping that maybe we'll start with seniority, and I'll just kick off the conversation with David and get your take on, you're obviously one of the better known names in our profession. And I'm curious to get your input about what your experience has been like as a Black man in the organ profession, and sort of what that has been like for you, positive or negative, and just see where that goes.
I've actually been very experienced as a Black person, having been one all my life. It's, in a way, that perspective sort of means that that experience has can only be assessed in comparison to experiences that I haven't had to some extent, because I've never not been a Black person. However, there certainly have been, I mean, again, given my age, there was a time in my early childhood, and my parents did very much encourage me to believe that the possibilities were endless, and that if I were well educated and prepared and hardworking, that I would be able to achieve whatever I wished to do. And I believed that, and pursued my education in that way. To some extent, I think they were right, and to some extent, there have been some disappointments along the way that are hard to assess in terms of what caused them. We are in a very subjective field where the way evaluations are made the criteria are so multiple and so uh, complex that it's not always clear as to why decisions are made, why positions are awarded to this person or that person, why this composition is published and another is not, or why, the reasons are not always clear. And then you add to that the complexity of religion, and that's a whole topic unto itself in terms of the ways in which church institutions function. And so I would say that yes, in looking back, I see many instances where, as an African American, I may have been treated differently, and certain opportunities have not perhaps been afforded me that might have under other circumstances. But it's impossible to really know. And so I remain grateful for those things that have been made available to me, and I try not to covet those that have been made available to others.
That's a good point. It's difficult to know, and it's in some ways it's easy to look for reasons that things work out a certain way when it's not based on your skill. I think we're all subject to finding reasons that saying, well, obviously, it couldn't have been the skill. I think I did very well, and so looking for alternate reasons. But it is impossible to know. Chelsea, I'm wondering what sort of your experience is. You both are published composers, and I know David brought up the idea of getting pieces published. And what's your experience been getting pieces published, and have you had positive or negative experiences doing that? You're on mute, my dear.
All right. Yes.
There we go.
I didn't have my pieces published initially, but almost more because I didn't look to have them published. I didn't really know if what I had was worthy of being published or should be pushed that way, because I didn't study composition as a major, and then I initially didn't look at myself as a composer. I think it was actually at Yale that Thomas Murray encouraged me to try to get my Taiwanese suite published, because he said that this is something that you should have wider distribution, that you'll have more than individual people asking you for the score. And I'm really grateful for his introduction, because it really is through connections often that you get exposed that way, because I know he introduced me to Wayne Leopold, and that's how that began. So I know that was a key moment, because it encouraged me in that direction. And I would say from that point, I actually haven't written that many pieces, but the solo pieces have been published. It's actually more difficult to get chamber music published, but that's for an entirely different reason. Right. There just isn't a huge market, I guess, for that, and publishing for that is not as popular. So yeah, I still have a lot of things too that are not published.
Right. I'm curious, we're on this composition topic, and Janet and Roshan can feel free to jump in when we talk about whether you've composed or when you select repertoire to play. I know both David and Chelsea have written music that is culturally significant to their ethnicity, and I'm curious sort of if you intentionally sought to write pieces on those themes, or if it was a commission, or sort of what's the inspiration, Chelsea, for instance, for your Taiwanese suite, or David for your organ setting of Deep River, just for example. Where does the inspiration come for that, and is it something that you feel, I'm sure you must feel more deeply connected than most people to those themes, and what's that like?
I can go first if you want. Well, for me, the impetus for writing that Taiwanese suite was definitely an experience I had visiting Taiwan around 2002. It was the year after my freshman year of college, the summer after, and I'd been there a few times before. My father is from Taiwan, and I grew up speaking Mandarin with my grandmother and going to Chinese school. And I always wrestled a little bit with my identity, being both Asian and white American, and where I fit in, because when I'm in Taiwan, I also stick out. People don't think that I will be able to speak Chinese, and are often asking me all kinds of questions. And then back in the States, people would ask me questions. Why do you go to Chinese school? Why would you go? So it's in both directions. But the music I grew up listening to with my grandmother, because she was my babysitter, she took care of me at home, were these really cute Taiwanese songs, children's songs mostly. But also I heard other folk songs, and that particular summer I got a recording of an or symphony orchestra that had arranged several songs for orchestra, and they were in these short 3-4 minute movements, and I really enjoyed the CD, and that got me going, as I could totally do this for the organ. It would be so colorful, and it would reflect some of my own background. And I'm really grateful I had help at the time, friends in school, composers who gave me input, and that was, yeah, that was, I ended up having so much fun playing it in the first performance that I kept playing it in other concerts. That's how it started.
That's fabulous. David, do you have?
Yeah, well, actually, of the pieces that I've written for the organ, which have a obvious ethnic reference, my 4 spiritual preludes for organ were actually written at the instigation of Dr. Mickey Thomas Terry, who said, "Why don't you do that?" so I thought, well, why don't I do that? And so I wrote 4 short pieces, one that was followed by 2 more, and somehow the suite of 3 didn't seem to make a lot of sense, so I had to write a 4th one to sort of pull it together. Oh, What a Beautiful City, and Deep River is the last one, and then Go Down Moses and Were You There are the 4 of them. And they're all spirituals that meant something to me. I grew up as an Episcopalian. Spirituals were not central repertoire in the churches that I grew up in, but they certainly were not unknown. And as an African American, I knew them independently of that. I worked with a wonderful choral director in junior high school who had wonderful choirs, and we always sang spiritual arrangements. And so I felt to do some organ pieces that were in an honest way, in my own compositional idiom, not trying to in any sort of way write in a stereotypical kind of style that would be immediately identified as whatever people think Black music is supposed to sound like. That's what I did, and I think they're sort of interesting pieces. And I also was asked to write a setting of Rise Up Shepherd for choir and organ. Again, this was a commission, but it was specific that spiritual was desired. And Rise Up Shepherd was, again, a spiritual that I loved from childhood. I sort of, but that setting is kind of like spiritual meets English anthem. And which and I'm happy that that setting is published and has been sung a good bit.
That's great. I want to bring Roshan and Janet into the conversation and talk about, from a performer's perspective, and whether you have specifically sought out music that is culturally significant to you to perform, and what your experience has been trying to find that music. I know I've been on a personal quest myself to find music by Black composers and women composers, and it's not as easy. I mean, you can't, you can swing your bag and hit 3 white men composers who are probably dead, but what's been your experience finding music that is culturally significant to you, and have you made a concerted effort to do that?
Sure, I'm happy to speak a little bit to this. I will say, sort of looking back through the years of school that I've had, that I realized when I had graduated from these, really wonderful institutions, that the bulk of music that I had learned, and almost all of the repertoire I learned, was not by composers of color, and not by female composers, just in the way that I think curriculum often is centered. And so my family is also Taiwanese American, and so one of the first pieces I actually learned was Chelsea's Taiwanese Suite, and so that was very meaningful for me, because I think a lot like she was saying, that it was music that my grandparents would know, sort of folk tunes that are really familiar to our sort of family heritage. But it, exactly like you were saying, it takes work to sort of do that research, and to sort of broaden your repertoire as a performer, and to say, even, in every program, I'd like to include one piece by a African American composer, one piece by a living composer, one piece by a female composer. Even that is almost sort of a radical idea, but I think I see that shifting, and I see that changing in the concerts that I've been going to, and I'm glad to see that sort of little by little.
I must agree with Janet. Yeah, we're definitely making more of a conscientious effort to, include, because I think because we're both still at school, or I'm still at school, there's a certain curriculum that you have to do. You have to play the Vierens, you have to play the Bachs. So before you know it, you've literally only got space for a 3-minute piece or something. And I think that's slowly changing, as Janet was saying. Coming from South Africa, I must be honest, there are very few people that even know what an organ is, in terms of Black people. So, because most of their worship services are done in a shanty or somewhere outside, where they don't really have the luxury of having an organ. So there are a few composers. I've played one, he's Indian, or he passed away in 2010, but he kind of incorporated Bach and certain African dances. His name is Surendran Reddy, and he's somebody really worth checking out. And after Nelson Mandela was released in 1994, he wrote a piece called Toccata for Madiba, and that incorporates, I think there's 5 different styles. It's almost like a mini concerto, I would say, of various styles of African dances that he wasn't an organist. This is what I actually found quite remarkable, that he wrote as though he was an organist, because I think this is quite difficult for people that don't play the instrument. Actually, it's one of those instruments where it's daunting, So yeah, and actually, David and Chelsea, I've heard and seen your pieces, obviously, and I think it's great that you write in such an idiomatic way. It makes it really easy, because you've thought, okay, going from the swell, going to the great, this is how it's going to work. Because most of the time it's so difficult to get, and for me, like Black composers, let's say, whose works I'd like to play, because they haven't written for the organ, or then I have to come out of my comfort zone, and this is where I should do more, and arrange and transcribe and all of that. So yeah.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point, Roshan, which is the idea that, I think even for me, my family and my peers were shocked that I wanted to study the organ when I was young. And I think it was completely normal that I studied piano. But I'm wondering, in your own specific experience, what was it like as a young organ student? And I'm particularly thinking about, I know that in all of my organ departments until I got to Peabody, everyone looked like me, and I'm curious what your experience has been like.
Right. I'm so glad you asked this. Actually, it hit me after you guys asked us to do this talk, and then I realized Kola is the first person of color, or let me say straight black person to ever teach me. And I thought about this, I think, for about 2 days, and I thought there's so much wrong with this. I'm African. I come from Africa, you know, and I've never had a black teacher. Not even for maths or science or anything. I've just never had somebody that looks like me teach me, you know. And with all due respect, it's always been white females, which, you know, they've been great teachers. And so Kola and I's relationship actually started very nicely a couple of weeks ago, where I kind of mentioned that to him, and I was like, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but also, you know, there's nothing I can do about it, and it's up to us to change this, you know. And I definitely think my career, or the way I view music and the organ, would be a little bit more informed or different had I had a role model that looked like me, or that modeled somebody in my environment. So yeah, I would say that it's not been difficult, because, as I say, I think as organists, we judge each other on our intellect and ability to adapt and all of that. And I've always found it remarkable that, you know, when we're playing competitions and recitals and all of that, you could be playing before me or after me, and you'd help me with my registration, and I'd help you, and we don't try and do each other in ever. I've never had that feeling. I think it's a very rare thing, and those people are not organists, I don't think. You know, so so most of the time it's really always been a fantastic experience. I cannot complain about it, but I must say, now that I'm a bit more aware, I wish and I hope I can be that person of color to other students, you know, that can actually show them, hey, this instrument can be played like this, you know, look at me, I can also do it, I'm exactly like you, you know? So yeah.
Picking up on some of the things that Roshan has just said, I mean, I think that one of the realities is that institutions tend to replicate themselves.
Yeah.
And they will go in a pattern that doesn't change until somehow they are burst out of that pattern. And American music schools, and perhaps schools of classical music worldwide, tend to be happy to go in their patterns usually. And if you look at faculty listings of the leading music schools, you'll find very, very, very few people of African color, at least. That may not be quite so for all colors, but certainly the African American presence in music school faculties is quite small. And I've tried my best to try to change that average, but I have been resisted on that. And I'll just leave it at that. With repertoire also the same things. There's a canon of music that that is considered standard. And you know, when I was an undergraduate 100 years ago, at the school I attended, Maurice Durflay was not admitted to that canon yet. And I'm not that old, you see, but I'm talking about the conservatism of music schools. And everyone knows where I went to school, and if you don't, you can look it up. But, and I'm very, very appreciative of the fine education I had there. But it was along a certain path. And my roommate had written a piece that he wanted me to consider for my senior recital. In fact, I had encouraged him to write it. And I was discouraged from doing a new piece. This is a new piece. Nobody knows it. It's you know, it's not written by a dead white person. You know, and so I was discouraged from composing. We were all discouraged from considering American music because the assumption was there wasn't any that was worth playing, and so that has begun to change. But the way in which our music institutions, whether they be conservatories or churches or concert halls or symphony orchestras, whatever, tend to replicate themselves, means that that for anything different to happen, there needs to be some real concerted energy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation when you talk about canon and how canon is created. And and that I think for some, it reinforces itself because it provides its own evidence for the most successful people in our profession look and sound a certain way. And until there are more people of color that are in the canon, there will not be any evidence to suggest that people of color can write anything worthy of being in the canon. And so it's this sort of vicious circle where until we can, break people into it, it's not going to change. And that's why I think it's so important for performers to play music that is not just by dead white men, and certainly not to ignore J.S. Bach and Louis Villain and Maurice Duruflé, but there's so much other great music out there, and by giving it visibility, you reinforce the idea or the fact that people of color and women of color have written fabulous music that deserves to be equally enjoyed as dead white men. So.
And also we open the possibility of the instrument. Actually, we make it so much more than what it is already, because your average person always thinks organ, church, hymns, that's it, and the instrument it can do so much more, so, but we need all these different spices, if you want to put it, to be able to do this.
Well, and I had that on my list of possible questions as well, to talk about how do we, and as we sort of come to the end of this conversation, how do we, as members of the Guild, as members of this profession, encourage more people to realize that not only are they welcome here, but they're wanted here and they're valued here, and that I saw this quote that said matter is the bare minimum. Black voices are important and they're valued. They don't just matter; they should be lifted. And so, how do we? It's no secret that if you go into any traditional Black church, you'll find a relatively untrained organist that can improvise circles around the most conservatory trained musician in this country. And so, how do we, open ourselves up to that possibility of music and that style of playing and that style of organ building, for that matter, as a profession and as an organization? And that's a loaded question, so I'm not sure that we'll arrive at an answer here, but
it probably has to start in our education system. We can't, because that's I've played at a Baptist church once, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to do it again. It's so intense in terms of not even the theology that's happening, the musical complexity it's really, as you say, I take my hat off to most of those organists they're doing wondrous things around there. But as it needs to be taught. It's a foreign language, or it's a foreign part of our language, which is embarrassing to actually say, because if we call ourselves professional musicians, we should be able to adapt to any of these styles. But yet again, going back to what David said, that canon, we kind of, it's installed in us, and until we break free of that, it's going to keep repeating itself. Yeah. So, yeah.
I would like to observe also that, or just offer a bit of my personal history, that I was practically born in an Episcopal church. And my love of the organ began because I heard a pipe organ played from before I knew what sound was. And played very capably by an African-American Juilliard-trained organist. Who was followed by another African-American Juilliard-trained organist when I was 6 years old, and who was succeeded several years later by another degreed, AGO-certified African-American organist. And so in a certain, perhaps my experience is a little unusual in that regard, but I am, it seems to me, and I've not done the empirical research, but it seems to me that there are fewer credentialed African-American organists now than there were. And there are other sort of sociological shifts that it seems to me that a young aspirant organist is not going to hear the same modeling that I heard. And that's an educational issue, and it's a cultural issue, and it's a lot of things.
Yeah, and that broaches on the larger topic of access to higher education, and we've been having this conversation at Peabody, where it matters not how much scholarship money you have for capable first degree students. Um, if you don't have the money, I wouldn't be where I am if my parents weren't able to pay for private lessons for 12 years before I got here. And so finding ways to break down the barriers to access, because there are so many barriers before the admissions audition to get into a conservatory or a college. There's so many barriers before that it is an educational issue, but I think it's much earlier than the indoctrination into the American conservatory system.
And I think one of the things that is important to realize is also that we're kind of in a moment that's really important, where we're centering Black and African American colleagues and friends and musicians, and that is really wonderful, because I think having conversations like this and starting to realize that we all have a stake in sort of in this conversation is really important, and that there's not sort of one quick fix, perhaps, that this is going to be a multi-step process for us to embark on, and that it takes a lot of listening, and it takes a lot of sort of stepping back and saying, okay, we can also sort of think about, how are we involved in organizations? How are we involved in institutions that we can make change a little bit at a time? And I think, we've talked a little bit about education, sort of mentorship of young organists is often, I think, how a lot of us found our way to this instrument. So, as much as we can sort of widen that and open up the possibilities to people who would not have had access or sort of that encouragement is just the first step sort of in getting to where we are, in our musical lives now.
Right, and the reality is that none of us individually are going to be able to do anything substantial enough to solve this problem, and not just in our profession, but in our country and in the world. None of us singularly have the power to make that kind of difference, but it's identifying the ways, and I think we've done that in this conversation, identifying the ways in which we as individuals can take small steps, and that combining just the 5 of our small steps makes a portion of one larger step. And so I think that's an important thing to realize, is that sometimes it can seem insurmountable, and I know from my experience, I have always been I've never struggled with the idea that Black people and people of color and women have value equal to mine. I've never struggled with that. But when you look at my repertoire list and what I studied at school and what I perform, you would never know that that was a value that I held dear. And so it takes wrestling with the ways in which you haven't an action lived up to what you say you believe, and rectifying that. So it's small steps, it's daily steps. But I think I'm grateful to be able to participate in this conversation as much as I can as a white man, and to recognize the ways in which I can do better, and the rest of us can do better. And it's really important, and I'm as difficult as it has been these last, we can say months, but it's been years and decades. I'm grateful that it seems that we're coming to a head here, which I think is fantastic. So I'm not sure if anyone has any other closing thoughts to offer about small steps or whatever has been on your mind.
I have to agree with you, Jordan. And for me, in the last couple of months, I've been speaking to some friends, composer friends, specifically Black, just because I've got a bit of a trajectory now, and asking them, hey, would you mind writing? I'll help you. Let's do this. And I'm a bit more aware in my repertoire list, also trying to get more Black composers and searching for them, because that's really what it is, because they're hidden, they're well hidden. So you just got to find it. But I think, as we spoke earlier on, it's a bit of an effort, but if we don't start it now, each generation is going to keep saying, somebody's going to start it, somebody's going to start it. And I think, yeah, we've just got to go full speed ahead.
Absolutely. Great. Well, this has been an incredibly fruitful conversation, and we are so grateful to each of you for participating and for your candor and honesty and willingness to share your experiences. And to everyone watching, obviously, as we've hinted, this conversation is only part of a beginning step towards understanding the ways in which our profession can better uplift the voices of non-white men, not just Black people, not just women, not just Asian people. There is room for everyone in this profession, and it's time that we put action to those words. And so I'm grateful to each of you for participating, and I hope you have.
Thank you for inviting this conversation.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Have a great weekend. Be well, stay safe, and I hope that we hear from each of you and all of you soon. So.
Okay.
Thank you.